Today's daf we're going to be learning is Sukkah daf Tevav. Today's daf is dedicated by Lisa Kalani in memory of Marjorie Glick, Miriam Chana Bat Rachel, and in honor of her loving daughter, Emma Rimberg, who learns the daf. Miriam recently passed away and was a bright, intelligent woman who loved learning and always had a smile for everyone. May her neshama have an aliyah from our learning. We're going to start right now at the top of Sukkah daf Tevav at the Mishnah. Tikra she'en aleha ma'aziva. We have a ceiling that wasn't solidified yet. It wasn't put together using cement or some sort of tar that they normally use to combine all the boards together. So it was kind of this loose roof. What can be done about this roof? Can it be used for a sukkah or not? Rashi says that we're talking about beams that are 4 tvachim wide. Soon we'll get to how does this connect with the previous Mishnah. We're going to have a machloket again, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir about this, but specifically the debate's going to be about what Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel had to say about this. Often we have Beit Hillel says this, Beit Shammai says that. But sometimes there's a debate about what exactly the debate between them was. So the Mishnah says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Beit Shammai omrim mifakpek venotel echat mibeintayim. Beit Shammai says you have to do two things. You have to mifakpek, which is not exactly clear what it is. Some people say it means take out the nails in between the boards. They were somewhat loosely nailed together. Other people say, no, it just means you have to move them a little bit. Okay, move them around to show that you're doing some sort of action to turn this into your sukkah. And in addition, Beit Shammai says you also have to notel echat mibeintayim. That means take out every other one and fill it with kosher schach. Ubeit Hillel omrim mifakpek o notel echat mibeintayim. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's a machloka Beit Shammai whether you need to do both of those things or one is sufficient. Rabbi Meir omer notel echat mibeintayim ve'eno mifakpek. Rabbi Meir says no. He doesn't really say who he's going with, but we don't know it's Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel. We'll see later how the Gemara understands this. But he says you have to take out every other one and fill it with kosher schach. You can't do mifakpek. That doesn't help you at all. So now we're going to try to understand what the issue is around this. What's the problem with this roof and what you're doing and why do you have to do what you have to do? And what's the debate between Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, and what's the debate between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir? Bishlama Beit Hillel. So the Gemara starts off and says Beit Hillel makes a lot of sense. Ta'amayu mishum ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asui, because they say you have to build it yourself. That's what we keep saying about a sukkah. So therefore, imifakpek avelei maaseh, inotel echat mibeintayim avelei b'maaseh. You can do either or, because either one is basically saying I'm putting down the schach for the purposes of the mitzvah. Either you move them around, or you take out half of them. You don't move them all. You just take out half, and then you put kosher schach in between. But Ela Beit Shammai, my time, what's the reason for Beit Shammai? If their issue is that you have to create it yourself, well then you shouldn't need both to move them and to take out one and put in kosher schach. And if you're concerned that these 4 tvachim beams look like a roof, and then that goes back to our previous Mishnah, so then it doesn't look like a roof if every other one is kosher schach. So therefore, it doesn't have an appearance anymore of looking like a roof of a house or a ceiling of a house, and therefore you don't have to worry anymore. This gzeirah would not apply. But in that case, right, you should say, notel echat mibeintayim sage, that should be enough. You don't need to also do this pikpuk, which is, again, either taking out the nails or moving it around. It shouldn't really be necessary. So what do they answer? Really, it is because we're worried about the ceiling, that it looks like a ceiling. Now, you have to explain Beit Shammai then. And this is what they really are saying. They're not saying you need both. We're reinterpreting the Mishnah. What they mean to say is, even though you move it around, that is not enough. Meaning you don't need pikpuk at all. You only need notel echat mibeintayim. So when Beit Shammai says mifakpek v'notel echat mibeintayim, what it means to say is even if you do pikpuk, it doesn't help unless you do notel echat mibeintayim, and that's because otherwise it really still looks like a roof. However, there's a problem with saying that that's Rabbi Yehuda's reading of Beit Shammai. Why? Then in the continuation, when it says Rabbi Meir omer notel echat mibeintayim aval lo yifakpek, that's exactly Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says you have to take one out, but you can't do pikpuk. It doesn't help you. Then Rabbi Meir hainu Beit Shammai. That basically Rabbi Meir is matching Beit Shammai. That doesn't make so much sense. Why would Rabbi Meir hold like Beit Shammai? And then also he's saying the same thing that Rabbi Yehuda says, but according to Beit Shammai. So Hachikama. We really are going to keep that reading, but we're going to explain what Rabbi Meir says right now. What he's saying is, Lo nechleku beit Shammai ubeit Hillel b'davar zeh. They don't argue about this at all. In fact, what you're saying is Beit Shammai. I say that Beit Hillel says the same thing. Now, that means that, again, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are both concerned for Gzerat Tikra, according to Rabbi Meir, and therefore they don't allow it unless you take out half of the boards and you put in kosher schach. But now we have a question on this. If that's the case, my kamashmalan, then what's this Mishnah coming to say? And as it turns out that this Mishnah is basically saying to Rabbi Meir, eat like Gzerat Tikra. He thinks there is Gzerat Tikra, both according to Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. That means we hold that way. The Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that according to Beit Hillel, there is no problem of Gzerat Tikra. You could just move them. It's only a problem of Taseh v'lo menasui. Late like Gzerat Tikra, they don't have this issue of Gzerat Tikra. Now, what's the problem with saying that? Well, it matches exactly our previous Mishnah. That works out nicely. But then, but that's exactly the same machloket in the previous Mishnah. You don't need the next Mishnah to tell you exactly the same thing as the previous Mishnah. Ditnan, as it says, Misachachim b'nisarim divrei Rabbi Yehuda. You can use nisarim, right? If they're already in place, so you just have to move them according to our Mishnah. But that you don't need a whole Mishnah to tell you that. And Rabbi Meir Oser, he says you can't use them because we're worried you might think that you can use your roof, a regular house. So therefore, the only way you could do it is by putting in new schach every other board. So why would both Mishnayot be saying the same thing? So now we're going to reinterpret the previous Mishnah differently than what we thought yesterday. Don't worry that it's going to confuse everything we saw yesterday because the Gemara is going to reject this. But right now, the Gemara is going to suggest. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, actually Rabbi Chia bar Abba is going to suggest this. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Reisha b'nisarim meshufin askina. They're talking about boards that were already what would you call them? In the Quran, they call them planed boards, meaning they were sanded down and they look really nice. And they're not just like a piece of wood you find on the street, but they're actually prepared wood. So if that's the case, what's the issue? And the issue is the reason why. Rabbi Yehuda says you can use these boards even though they look really nice because they're still not susceptible to impurity. Rabbi Meir says they're very similar, though, to finished products of other things that are susceptible to impurity, and therefore we should forbid them so that people don't think that you can use other things that are susceptible to impurity. And therefore, we're going to say that's the machloket in the previous Mishnah. It has nothing to do with everything we just explained yesterday, which is we're all worried about this roof and people will think that you can use your house. No, we're worried that you'll think that other things that are susceptible to impurity are okay to use. In which case, and our Mishnah is talking about unfinished boards, and Gzerat Tikra. So now they say, wait a minute. Rav Yehuda amar Rav de Amal, but according to Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav, he said, "Sechacha b'chitzin zcharim kshera b'nekevot psula v'lo gazar zcharim atu nekevot." So hachanami lo nigzar nisarim meshupim atu kelim. But why would you institute this? Say something that is like a utensil, but really isn't susceptible to impurity is forbidden so that you won't confuse it with something that is susceptible to impurity, which are these boards. Lest you might come to think that a regular utensil would be able to be used. We don't do that because there's charim and nikevot we don't do that with. We don't do it with male and female ones. Remember the male arrows that are flat and they're wooden and therefore they're not susceptible to impurity. They're not forbidden because of the nikevot, which actually have a receptacle to hold the arrow in place. We don't say that. So we shouldn't say it here as well, in which case they reject that option. So therefore we go back to square one. You'd have to say that the first part, really the first part is the previous Mishnah, is really talking about what we thought, which is Gzerat Tikra. We're worried that you might confuse it with a roof. Or a ceiling. This seifa plige b'Gzerat Tikra, and then our Mishnah as well. So again, if the gubitarti zimnei lamali. So again, why do we need this machloket twice? So the Gemara answers Rabbi Yehuda de ka'amar le Rabbi Meir. Seif tarte zimnei lamali. Okay, seifa, the second part, our Mishnah, is really coming as a continuation of the previous Mishnah. And what's it coming to say? It's more of a conversation between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir based on their previous machloket. Rabbi Yehuda comes to say, Sefer Rabbi Yehuda, de ka'amar le Rabbi Meir. He's saying to Rabbi Meir, Amai ka'asart b'nisarim mishum gzerat tikra. What you think these boards are forbidden because you might confuse it with a ceiling? Hi svara lebeit shamayu. That's all Beit Shammai's logic. De'itlehu. It's Beit Shammai de'itlehu. It's Beit Shammai who's worried about Xera like that. And we don't hold like Beit Shammai. Ubeit Hillel lo gazri. Beit Hillel, what he's saying is, Beit Shammai, again, in our Mishnah it says, Rabbi Yehuda says, Beit Shammai omrei mefakpek v'notel lecha mibein time. And Beit Hillel say, mefakpek o notel lecha mibein time. In other words, Beit Hillel just needs to fix the problem of taseh v'lo menasui. Beit Shammai is the one who says, it's actually a more serious problem. And comes Rabbi Meir to say, no, you need to be notel lecha mibein time according to everybody. You're wrong. There's no machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. I view their opinions differently. They don't actually debate this issue, in which case that's the discussion between them. And therefore our Mishnah is the same thing. It's just a further discussion. So now they say, wait a minute. This only works according to Rav. Let's go back to Rav and Shmuel from yesterday. Remember? De'amal, they'll remind you in case you forgot. The debate between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir is when they're 4 tefachim wide, which is exactly our case. Rabbi Meir eat legzeratika, Rabbi Yehuda late legzeratika, right? One holds there is and one holds there isn't. It means Rabbi Yehuda never holds gzeratika, which would fit with our Mishnah. But ela l'shmuel damar b'sheim behen arba'a machloket aval yesh behen arba'a divrei hakol psula. But once they're 4 tefachim wide, even Rabbi Yehuda agrees it's a problem. Seifa b'mai plige. So what's the machloket between them? To which the Gemara answers, what's their machloket? Bibi tule tikra kam biflage. Mar savar betzla b'hachi, mar savar b'hachi lo batla. There's something in our Mishnah that doesn't appear in the previous Mishnah, which is how do you resolve this issue? So we're going to say that according to Shmuel, that both think at 4 tefachim, it's a problem of tikra. The question is, how do you get out of it? Is it enough to just move it? Is that sufficient just to move them a little bit? That's sufficient to Rabbi Meir. Once you move it, you've shown that I know that there's an issue here. And despite that, right, I'm making the sukkah, knowing that I can't just use a roof, I have to move them around. That's enough to say, oh, well, you clearly know what you're doing, and you know that you can't just do this with your house because you did some sort of action. Therefore, we're not going to be concerned anymore. Rabbi Meir says that's not sufficient. You have to actually fill in with kosher schach, and that is the only way to resolve your problem. Again, Rabbi Yehuda also thinks you can fill in with kosher schach, but he thinks that you could do either or. You don't need both. Okay, whereas Rabbi Meir says only if you fill in with kosher schach in between is it going to be obvious that this isn't like a regular ceiling and you won't have the issue of gzerat tikra. New Mishnah. We actually have a very short daf today. If you fill your sukkah with, these are going to be things that are susceptible to impurity, either metal skewers. Some people say they're wooden, and then you have to explain why they're susceptible to impurity, but let's just understand that we'll go by the interpretation that they're metal skewers, and metal, flat and things that don't have a receptacle when it comes to wood is not susceptible to impurity, but when it comes to metal, it is. So if you have these shipudim, these skewers, metal skewers, or arukot hamita, which are the boards of the bed, and I have to figure out why boards of the bed. The boards of the bed, imagine you have a base of a bed with 4 boards. We're talking about one of those boards. Each one in and of itself is just a piece of wood. So we're going to have to figure out why it is susceptible to impurity and can't be used as schach. If for all the kosher schach, the non-kosher schach, whatever the width of the non-kosher schach is, if you have kosher schach, the same width, imagine you have all these boards going across, you have non-kosher ones and then kosher ones, non-kosher, kosher, non-kosher, kosher. So you have all throughout your sukkah, kosher schach separated by strips of non-kosher schach. Again, we saw that if it's 4 tefachim wide already, it's a problem because that takes up a significant space of non-kosher schach. But we're talking about less than that. If you have kosher, non-kosher, kosher, non-kosher, kosher, non-kosher, your sukkah is okay. If you take a pile of grains, stalks of grain, we saw this the other day, and you hollowed it out and created a space underneath, since your schach was there before your sukkah, this is no good. So the Gemara is going to start off and suggest, this issue about having equal parts of kosher, non-kosher, and saying your sukkah is good means that this is a proper, so to speak, mechitza, proper wall, right? It's not a wall, it's a roof, but proper roof. Now, that seems to raise a question against what Rav Huna, the son of Rabbi Yoshua, said. De'itmal, we learned this in Masechet Shabbat and Eruvin. I forget if it came up, which one it came up in, but it was in the context of both Shabbat and Eruvin in terms of mechitzot. Parutz ke'omed, Rav Papa Amar mutar, Rav Huna b'reit Rav Yoshua Amar asur. If you have equal parts of the wall standing and breached, then your wall is not a good wall. This seems to indicate that it is. So this seems to go against and raise a question against what Rav Huna b'reit Rav Yoshua said. Rav Papa said it's okay, but Rav Huna said it's not. Amar lecha Rav Huna b'reit Rav Yoshua. He could explain, no. When it means equal parts, it doesn't exactly mean equal, because you can never really get equal. And imagine that you have this non-kosher schach and you want to push in kosher schach. You're going to need a little more space in order to push things in and out. Otherwise, if you don't have more space than that, right, it's not going to fit. You can't, if it's fit exactly, imagine when you try to put a book on a shelf and it exactly fits, it's really hard to get it in. You need a little more space, which means that the schach pasul is going to take up less space than the schach that's kosher. But now the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Ha'if Charlotte, I'm saying you could do it exactly 50-50. And it sounds like the Mishnah means it's 50-50. It says, kimotan, just like it. To which Amar Rabbi Ami b'ma'adif. No, it means that you specifically have to make these a little bit wider. Okay? The only way it's going to work is if you make it a little bit wider. And then it's, again, it doesn't raise a question against Rav Huna b'reit Rav Yoshua. Rav Amar, afilu tema b'she'em ma'adif. I'll give you a different one, a different answer. This is from the weaving loom. Remember the warp and the woof? So if you have, it's a crisscross. If you look at the pictures, you'll see they don't do it like a crisscross. There's two ways to understand. Either you crisscross them, in which case you have the schach pasul underneath and the schach kasher above. And we're going to assume that if you crisscross them, again, it's a little hard to understand why it'll come out more. Somehow they say it will come out more. Probably because there's some overlap where there's also kosher schach and non-kosher. But the pictures show it differently, which is, again, there's different commentaries and the different pictures show it in different ways. But the pictures, if you look at today's pictures, again, they can be found on our website, on the daf post for today, and they can also be found in the details of the podcast if you're looking at the podcast, if you're listening to the podcast, or they can be found also, I send them in the links. When I send the links every day on the WhatsApp groups, if you're part of those WhatsApp groups, there I send a link to the pictures. So now, the other option is to say that the schach pasul is on the bottom layer, and on top of that, you overlap it with schach kasher that sits on top of the schach pasul. So if the space is equal, okay, you have space for kosher, space for non-kosher, but the kosher takes up not only the space, but it also rests on top of the kosher schach. So it's going in the same direction. It's not shti and arev crisscross. What it means is that it overlaps. Opposed to crisscross, it just overlaps. So imagine you have a schach pasul here and a schach pasul here, and then the schach kasher that goes on top overlaps on both of those. So it will have to be a little bit wider, in which case it's not actually 50-50, which then again doesn't disagree with Rav Yoshua. Then you would say if it was exactly 50-50, it wouldn't actually work. Okay, last part for today. Oba arukot hamita. Now we're going to start about these boards of the bed. Lema Masaya Leila Rabbi Ami Bar Tavyumi. Why don't we suggest that this supports Rabbi Ami Bar Tavyumi? Ta'ama Rabbi Ami Bar Tavyumi. Schacha beblai kelim psula. He says if you take clothing is susceptible to impurity. But if you have shreds of clothing, the clothing is totally worn out, disgusting, not wearable anymore at all, and it's shreds. If you have these shreds of clothing, since originally it came from something that was susceptible to impurity, the remainder of this is still susceptible to impurity. It doesn't lose its status. Happens to be a debate about this. Rabbi Ami Bar Tavyumi says it is. It's therefore, if schacha beblai pelim psula, you can't use this for your sukkah because it's susceptible to impurity. So now it's the same thing with this bedboard. The bedboard was part of a bed, but now it's just a board. And it's removed from a bed. So originally it was susceptible to impurity because it was part of a bed. Now you've removed it. It's not part of the bed anymore. It's just a wooden board. But yet it's like blai kelim, and yet we're saying it's still susceptible to impurity. So why don't we say that our Mishnah can be a good proof for what this Emora said, Rabbi Ami Bar Tavyumi? To which the Gemara says, no. K'da'amar Rabbi Chanan, amar Rabbi, ba'arucha u'shtei kra'ayim, b'ktzara u'shtei kra'ayim. Just like Rav Chanan said in the name of Rabbi elsewhere, that we're talking about the long board, right? Imagine the bed. There's long side, and then there's the short side, the width of it. So the length ones are called the arukah, the long ones, and the ones that go on the width are called the short ones. We're talking about a board here with its two legs. He answers that somewhere else. We could say hachanami, likewise, we'll explain here. It means the board with its legs. Where was this said? I'll go on a little further since it's a very short daf. A bed is mitaher, can become impure when it's whole. Chavila means whole. Umitaheret chavila. If you put the whole thing in a mikveh somehow, I don't know how you would, but you can purify it whole. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. V'chachamim omrim, but the rabbis say mitamet evarim umitaheret evarim. It can become tamei in parts, and it can also become pure in parts. Mainihu, what does this mean, parts? That's where Rav Chanan, Amar Rav Chanan, Amar Rebbe, aruka u'shtei kra'ayim, v'ktsara u'shtei kra'ayim. That's what we mean in parts, that it can't just be the board itself, but the board with its legs, and that's what we're referring to here. Lemai chazia, what is this worthy of? What's this? What can you use it for? Lemismachinu agudo lemetav alayu mishta ashle. Okay, this can be used to basically put it up against a wall. You can sit on it, and you can tie ropes from it to the wall and attach it to the wall somehow. And then you can actually sit on it. Okay, so you can use it as a kind of mattress, almost as a couch. If you tie ropes from it to the wall, it can actually be used for something. So it's functional in some sort of way, and therefore it's makabel tuma, but this wouldn't teach you anything about the blai kelim because it's not really blai. It still has use. And therefore, they reject that possibility of saying that this could be used as a support for Rabbi Ami bar Yomi. With that, we will finish for today. Have a great day, everyone.